Every competitive game has some kind of meta. Some characters will be strong, some will be niche, and some will be sadly aggravating to fight. Today, I want to open a discussion to why I think balancing competitive games is a lot harder than some people think. This video will primarily focus on Rivals 2, since that's the main game that I talk about on this channel, but the ideas can be applied to most competitive games off the top of my head. I made a video kinda related to this topic in the past, but if you want a full breakdown of what I think should define a top tier, and why some characters probably should never be the best in their respective games, I'll leave it linked down below. For a quick summary though, I think that a game is probably healthy if the best characters or strategies are interactive, have counterplay, and promote picking diverse options. For example, Steve in Smash Ultimate has lots of options he can pick, so he checks that box. But he's not necessarily interactive, and once he starts rolling, the counterplay is pretty limited, making him overall really frustrating to fight. I'd argue that just checking one box of being expressive isn't enough to deem the character healthy, especially when they're considered the cornerstone of that game's competitive play. This however brings into question of how would you even approach a balance change here? Sure, you could nerf Steve by making a few options worse so that he doesn't have access to them, and that would make him less of a meta-defining force, but it doesn't necessarily make him more interactive or more fun for either the Steve player themselves or their opponent. This is why interactivity is so important, since if there's not much choice as the player or much choice as the opponent, neither player has a lot of fun. The game becomes who can do the QuickTime event the fastest. I think another good way to describe how interactivity leads to more fun in games is to think of Mario Kart. There's tons of maps in the games with little shortcuts, speed boosts, and items. It's up to you as the player to decide which route you'll take and where you want to be. However, when that choice gets stripped away and the random map picker takes you to Baby Park, it's suddenly a lot less fun and you have a lot of control that's just gone from the game now. Now that we understand how valuable interactivity is, let's look at how it's applied to a fighting game like Rivals 2. To be brief and curate this complex topic to a little more understandable approach, I've picked out a character that I think has a lot of tools that require precise counterplay from opponents, and, more specifically, forces opponents to apply the correct counterplay to each option he has. That being Forest Burn. Forest Burn has good disjoints, and has smoke, clone, and a deceptive recovery. Each of these options is pretty unique to him, and as I said, they each have unique counterplay. Moves like Cape require opponents to CC them, Clone forces opponents to either challenge it or parry it. His aerials, which can be pretty hard to punish, are tethered to his middling speed stats, allowing you to outmaneuver them, and Smoke forces you to clear it with safe pokes. And his recovery forces players to stay on their feet, reacting to little hints that he gives out to what route he'll end up taking. I think all this comes together to make a character with a lot of depth and interesting mechanics. And this isn't to say that Forest Burn isn't his peak place in the meta, or that he doesn't need any more tuning to his mechanics or balancing, but there is currently both depth to his kit, giving the player lots of options, and depth to his counterplay, forcing opponents to stay attentive and adaptable throughout the match. This however leads me to my first big point of why balancing a game like Rivals 2 specifically is so hard. Earlier this year, some of Forest Burn's tools were simply too strong. Previously, Clone had been really fast on startup in tandem with his safe aerial disjoints. This allowed him to double jump, clone, and then land on an opponent with a safe move, all while Clone honed in on the opponent like a heat-seeking missile. If an opponent got hit by Forest Burn's landing aerial, congrats! You've now won neutral as Forest Burn. And if they successfully blocked it, they now have to decide to stay in shield or try to hit fours. Both of these have a downside, however, since if Forest Burn decides to pop Clone, and you've dropped shield, you've still lost neutral. And if he decides not to pop Clone, he can reset the scenario all over again while your shield is only getting weaker and weaker. This super strong option, however, from Forest Burn got a yummy helping of nerfs. His aerials were made slightly worse, but not terrible, and Clone Startup got a pretty heavy nerf, making it so that he can no longer reliably use his setup, or really use Clone at all in neutral for that matter. This took away a lot of Forest Burn's expression, since the tool that was nerfed the hardest was the one that made Forest Burn really stand out the most. He was no longer a unique, deceptive character. I mean, his disjoints still worked fine, I guess, but that only allowed him to play like a slower, hard-hitting sword wielder. but his entire identity past that was a little iffy at best. Finally, and currently as of writing this script, Forestburn is in a kinda weird in-between. A handful of his normals have been made a little worse, like his back air sweet spot being moved around, and made a little weaker overall in neutral. But his clone is also a little better than it was the last patch. There's still depth to his kit, and counterplay like I said earlier, but it came with the cost of either having a great disjoint that allowed him to wall opponents, or strong, interesting specials that gave him more ways to mix up opponents and have more control over the match. And this is all being said without mentioning that Forestburn is still not really incentivized to approach, since he doesn't really have a great way to close gaps, and kinda relies on opponents to bring themselves to him. All that's to say that I don't mean this to be a video critiquing or complaining about Forestburn, but kinda the opposite. I think Forestburn has so many great qualities to him, but there's still clearly so many tools in his kit, that for one to be great, all the others have to be just okay to keep him from steamrolling the competition, or becoming super unfun and unintuitive to fight. Let's take the critique I made about Forest having a hard time approaching, or more precisely, there not being an incentive for Forestburn to approach. What would you do to fix this? Sure, you could tie Smoke and Clone to a resource that you gain for landing hits, but that doesn't make him better at approaching. It only artificially forces him to, making him much clunkier and worse overall. You could buff his movement and maybe give him a better initial dash, air drift, or wave dash to let him close gaps. But that would also buff his ability to mix you even harder with Clone, or kite your hitboxes with his disjoints. You'd give him a more consistent poke tool by buffing his disjoints, however that would simply bring him back to a near replica of the state he was in earlier this year that was overall too strong. Obviously, I've picked solutions that have easy counterpoints to make, but there's not really a clear and easy way to add this element to Forestburn's kit, and that's okay. It's what makes balancing hard and why changes need to happen over time, so that developers have time to tune things as they go. A good example of this not happening how it should can be seen in that fateful December patch from last year, where Fleet and Orcane got more or less given the Old Yeller experience. Players of these two fighters were met with massive nerfs, all within one patch, with little to no compensation buffs, both removing the character's identity and expression, while not necessarily making them more fun or even engaging for the opponent to fight. I think these changes would have gone over a lot more smoothly if they were spread across multiple patches, with tuning to them happening between each one. Let's take a closer look at the Arcane patch in particular, with Bubbles being nerfed, his weight being nerfed, Bubble Butt being nerfed, his side B, specifically the ability for it to snap to ledge or be used as a recovery tool, being nerfed, his neutral B being nerfed, and his ability to stall with down special in midair being removed. There were no compensation buffs in this patch, and parry was also made 3 frames faster on projectiles, meaning that players can now CC bubbles and parry them, even out of shield, guaranteeing Orcane would get a world of parry stun if he was ever caught using bubbles out of turn. I don't think these patch notes were all necessarily bad. I think nerfs like the change to his neutral special and Bubble Butt were both needed to reel the character in, and provide more counterplay, since previously both of them were simply too strong to the point of limiting opponents' engagement. However, changes like making his recovery notably worse, his down special no longer stall him, and bubbles being easier to counter, only removed options from the Arcane player, and punished him from trying to access the most unique and expressive parts of his kit. This leads me to one of my other core points of our discussion today, being how do you keep those expressive, flexible options strong and fun to use, without making them feel uninteractive, overpowering, or outright unbeatable to an opponent? This one I actually have answers to, unlike the Forestburn question I posed. There is a handful of ways to go about balancing these tools. First of all, you have to make sure there's some level of counterplay. Things like making parry faster against projectiles rewards players for properly using a high-risk, high-reward feature. But things like adding extra exploitable weaknesses to a character, like lowering their weight or increasing a hurt box, can also do the trick. A good example of this, in my opinion, is Orcane's recovery. Obviously, Orcane excels both at closing gaps and scrapping, as well as restricting movement on stage. However, when he's off stage or in the air, his options are much more limited. Sure, he can Orca Hop, but since there's no hitbox, you can pretty easily ledge hog him, and then hit him with a get up attack if he's even able to make it past the ledge. Speaking of ledge, he has a hard time there too. His lack of a real forward air means that he can't jump off the ledge swinging like someone like Loxodon or Olympia. Him being vulnerable in these places is what makes him more unique to fight, however, since while he can be strong, slippery, and even a little annoying while grounded on stage, he becomes a lot weaker and more vulnerable the second he leaves the stage. Truthfully, I think Orcane's at a pretty good spot right now, since those big nerfs I talked about earlier have been walked back to a degree. I would argue him and his counterplay are both a little less expressive than Forest Burns currently, but I'd imagine upping the DI multiplier on Bubbles while also giving him control over Bubbles' drift once they've left the puddle could easily patch that up, if the devs thought it was the right thing to do. This leads us to my third point about why balance is hard. It's mainly just finding out what feedback is quality and what feedback is biased. To pull back the curtain just a bit, if you didn't know, I'm an Orcane main. So I have a bias in making him stronger, more interesting, and more unique. However, this can apply to anyone and their main. Getting feedback can range from being really quality to really not. Take for instance the most recent round of Loxodon nerfs. According to Dan, the team observed that Loxodon was consistently performing higher than expected in online ranked matchmaking at every rank. And while online ranked matchmaking isn't a great balance tool, with no majors happening since Genesis, I imagine they made a small exception and pulled the trigger on a few nerfs based on the data they had. Obviously, players reacted pretty badly to this, however. And while I don't blame them, I thought it was pretty bad too. Taking a step back and realizing that the forward air was -2 on shield pre-nerf, and his neutral B could kill as early as 50 in some scenarios with certain setups, puts the patch into a much better perspective. Personally, I'd like to see some kind of small exchange for these changes, since straight nerfs across the board always feel bad. But I think our community bias of perceiving Loxodon as underperforming led us to getting it a bit backwards, since obviously some tuning was needed in these areas. If you ask me to speak a little less objectively about this, I'd like to see Loxodon get a little more control and expression added back into his kit. But I'm not really sure how to do that without giving him a new mechanic or building on top of something he already has, like allowing him to cancel something like side B or up B into down B. But it's pretty clear why he got the nerfs he did, even if they seemed unjustified at the time. Finally, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and I don't mean you or Loxodon, we just got done talking about that. The top tiers and Rivals 2 seem to never get nerfed. Both Zetterburn and Rano got a mixed bag of changes in the most recent patch, like Rano's aerial needles being changed a little bit to make their angle more precise, and Daka's adjusted so Rano players have a much smaller window to use it were good. These changes don't remove Rano's identity, but made the strong, hard to combat parts of his kit harder for him to pull off, allowing for more counterplay and better positioning or DI mix-ups. However, he also got a pretty major buff to his up air, making it a lot more consistent. And while his up air in my opinion was pretty lackluster to his Rivals 1 variant, I think now it's notably very strong and probably needs some tuning, walking it back to being a solid option, but not oh so powerful. The same can be said for Zetterburn, who got his forward air's hitbox nerfed so that you need to be a lot more precise when using it as a kill option, but his fireball is also faster now, letting him use it as a real projectile instead of an awkward mid-range poke and combo tool. These changes were seen as a buff to Zetterburn due to how the patch notes were worded, but truthfully, this was probably an overall nerf. Sure, Zetter has better poke tools, but the fireball's so fast that he can't really run behind it anymore. Truthfully, Fireball was never great for its zoning, but it was really good at breaking zoning, since it was a built-in wall that could move in front of Zetterburn, and attempting to block it would only get you stuck in your shield for a few million years, thanks to Zetterburn's incredible shield pressure. This change wasn't all bad, of course, since now Fireball is much better at covering longer distances and being used as a real projectile. Sadly, projectiles and Rivals aren't super strong due to the parry, and the ranges that Zetter can combo with Fireball are now a lot more slim. This leads me to believe that outside of the Rano up air change, that these changes were pretty fair and even good. I think Zetterburn being so popular and strong is what makes players have such a bias against him, not necessarily that he's strong. Since even though his changes in this patch were greatly a net nerf, players still interpreted it as a buff. Truthfully, I think the patch notes should have been a bit more clear here, since they were worded as a buff, and the devs have said that there's a nerf coming for Zetter soon, that barely missed this patch since they couldn't get it to feel great. This relates back to my original opener about how would you even go about nerfing characters, when making an option worse only makes the character less interactive and unique, instead of actually making the character interesting and balanced. This is why I think the Zetter Fireball change that I mentioned is actually pretty good. It gives Fireball more utility, but also slims down the combo potential. Rano's Needle change was also good in the opposite direction, slimming down the utility but maintaining the combo potential, since now the move has a much shorter range, making it more committal and less safe, but still giving lots of reward when used correctly. This means that opponents to both Zetter and Rano should also see more reward when applying correct counterplay, like being selective with their positioning and timing defensive options correctly. Overall, I think that Rivals 2 is moving in the right direction balance-wise. I personally think balance changes being twice a month is good for the game, but I think currently patches are potentially too big. I think taking small swings at problems and then doubling down on them in the next patch if they aren't solved would help keep the game feel fresh, without blowing up a character's identity all within one patch. That just about wraps up my ideas on why competitive balancing is a lot more nuanced than a lot of people think. Thanks so much for watching to the end, and let me know if you think I got it right, or missed the mark a bit with this one. I wanted this video to be more of a discussion topic, and it's hard to get that nuance across without rambling in this kind of video format. Speaking of what y'all think, I'm working on a video that should come out in about a week or so about the best stages in the game, and why players like them or dislike the bad ones. You can give your opinion in the Google form, which I've linked in the description and probably the pinned comment. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now!